Thank you for coming or for tuning in to the second seminar in our Science in the News Fall 2022 seminar series. The talk tonight will have 3 parts, and then in between each one we'll break for questions and then a couple minutes of rest if anybody needs to go get a drink or anything. So our speaker tonight is Wadhwa, MD, PhD student in the Health Sciences and Technology program at Harvard and MIT. And tonight she'll be telling us about To Infinity and Beyond, Human Health in Space.
Thank you for the introduction, Maggie. Hi everyone, I'm Anna. As she mentioned, I'll be talking about human health in space. So let's get started. As she mentioned, we will have 3 parts, and we will have breaks for each of those, but absolutely feel free to interrupt with questions at any point. Totally happy to make this more of a casual thing rather than a very strict seminar style. So before we get started and jump into kind of the physiology or the medical aspects of things, what's the first thing you think of when you think of space? Any volunteers? Stars, yeah. I'm a big sci-fi nerd, so I like to think of Star Wars, Star Trek, Interstellar. All those movies, those glamorized Hollywood movies are always characterized by, there's some big problem that happens. Then Matt Damon on Mars has to brilliantly problem solve his way out of it. And the reality, however, is that yes, space travel is hard, but it's not just hard from like an engineering standpoint. The main takeaway I want you to get from this is that there are very real biological problems that happen in space as well, and we're trying to fix those problems so that at one point we can try and make human space exploration much more of a real possibility. And so the reason that this is relevant is, NASA recently has begun planning the Artemis missions, hoping to return to the moon by 2024. That might become 2025 recently. And also even journey to Mars by the 2030s or early 2040s. But the reason that we need to be understanding of how space travel is affecting our bodies is that it takes 7 months to get there alone. And then we'd want to do an operation there and then come back. That's a 3-year mission. 1, what's going to happen to our bodies when we come back to Earth? And 2, once we get to Mars, will we even be healthy enough to carry out our operation, our mission? So can you brainstorm any health risks that may happen in space? Any ideas on things that can go wrong?
Muscle atrophy.
Muscle atrophy? Yeah, that's a good one. Anybody else? Yeah, bone loss. Very, very important. I will be talking about those today. So the first kind of sphere of causes or problems that happen in space is microgravity. And this is essentially similar to zero gravity, like what astronauts are experiencing on the International Space Station. And that can cause things like bone loss, muscle mass loss, fat loss. And interestingly enough, when we're on Earth, there's all this gravity pulling on us all the time. And that is affecting all of the fluid in our body, and it's pulling down. But when we're up in space, there's no more gravity pulling our fluid, pulling our blood down. And so the blood can then instead rush to our head. It can cause a lot of swelling, a lot of headaches, problems with our vision, and more. We'll explore those a little bit. Radiation from both, the sun and electromagnetic radiation that we think of, like UV and X-rays, but also, metal particles, subatomic metal particles are traveling through space, and those can also cause radiation type damage to our immune system, to our blood regeneration, causing cancer in the long run as well. The overlap of both microgravity and radiation can contribute to immune system problems, vision problems. And then finally, there's also a whole sphere of other problems outside of microgravity and radiation, whether that be isolation, the stress of emission, there's sleep irregularities that will happen. And so today, I want to focus specifically on, bone, muscle, and fat as one group, vision as another group, and then sleep as one final aspect of things that can go wrong. But do keep in mind that there's, these are non-exhaustive lists in and of themselves, and so a lot can happen. So let's get started with muscle, fat, and bone. Why do we even care about bones? Why are they important? Obviously, they're important for our daily functioning, our missions, just walking, breathing, every part of our function, whether it's like organ protection, daily support of life systems, we need our bones to function. And so in space, we get conditions similar to osteoporosis. It's essentially the bone density loss that you mentioned earlier. Our bones are essentially becoming more hollow. If this is what healthy bone looks like, and healthy bone does have some amount of holes, you could say, in it, osteoporosis, or in space, we see even more of those hollow spaces in our bone, and this is bad because it's less able to support weight, it's more prone to fractures, to breaks, this can damage blood supplies. Obviously, there's no great hospitals like MGH or Brigham and Women's in space on the International Space Station, and so these kind of injuries can really be damaging and even life-threatening, whereas on Earth it might not be so. Why do we care about muscle? Oh, there should be a video. If I'm able to get it. Oh, awesome. Well, not awesome that she's collapsing, but if it plays. How do I go back? Okay. Let me troubleshoot real quick. All right, browse YouTube. Let's do that. Oh, okay. If we can get past the ad. So the specifics of what she's saying here are not important. But if you watch here, she's collapsing. Her muscles and bones, they've atrophied in space. And so we can see just how extensive the damage of space can be, to the point where we really can't function afterwards. And so, obviously, again, very important for our daily functioning. And I hope that just kind of illustrates exactly the kind of things that can go wrong in space and then the effects of them once we get back to Earth. Lastly, why do we care about fat? I think a lot of us have a tendency to think of fat loss as a good thing, trying to work out, be more active, lose weight. But if we think about it, astronauts tend to be in pretty peak physical condition, and so fat actually has very important functions for our body. And so if astronauts are losing their fat, they're not able to have things like energy reserves. If we think about, basic body metabolism, they have less insulation, warmth. I don't imagine the International Space Station is a balmy 70 degrees. They do keep it kind of chilly up there. And then finally, there are certain vitamins and hormones that need fat to function. And so if you're losing fat, even on Earth, actually, you can have impairments or problems with your vitamin and hormone functioning. And so that's just kind of exacerbated in space. And then finally, how we can fix this. This is how astronauts exercise on the International Space Station, kind of funky. Essentially, we know that weight-bearing activity can increase bone growth, can promote muscle mass, retention, so you're not losing your muscle or your bones, but there's no gravity in space, so you can't exactly get there. Instead, they do things like resistive band exercises or cycling, like she's doing here, or they can strap themselves down in just place. These are the little straps. And then it's almost like hitting your feet against the floor, and they're trying to do that to mimic the effect of like running on a treadmill to get that simulation of weight-bearing activity. But even this it isn't really great. Obviously, as we saw with that video, astronauts can still have very significant bone, muscle, and fat losses that can affect their functioning once they get back to Earth. Another solution that has been kind of more prominent in recent years has been using certain medications. I won't get into the weeds of it right now, but there are some medications that have been shown to prevent bone loss and muscle mass loss, but the problems with that is that obviously we don't want astronauts being necessarily very medicated when they're up on the ISS, and so these still need to go through a lot more like clinical trials and rigorous testing before it can be considered a real possibility. So just a summary of what we just went over. We see losses in bone, muscle, and fat. The solutions as of right now are exercise and potentially medications, but these are still absolutely very much so in the works. Any questions?
Great. We can take questions from the audience, and then if there's anybody watching on the live stream, there's the chat function in YouTube, so feel free to drop any questions that you have in there. So, any questions?
How long, is the process of physical therapy after, astronauts?
That's a good question. So if, I don't know, does that transmit to the live stream directly?
It's just gonna make the speakers.
Okay, yeah, so if that didn't transmit, she asked about how long it takes for recovery after returning to Earth, and the question is, we don't know. It depends a lot on the individual astronaut, on how long they were up there, whether or not they were going intermittently, if they were there for a long time consistently. There are thoughts, I think the general consensus or the general idea as of right now is that eventually, maybe around a year or so, with consistent exercise and a gradual return to weight-bearing activity, people can recover from space travel. However, there have been a couple of recent papers that show that even after 1 year of recovery, the bone architecture, like I showed, with those little holes in it, that bone architecture is still very different pre-spaceflight travel. So, there's starting to be this idea in mind that perhaps even after long recovery periods, things might be permanently changed, but we don't know yet. We don't exactly have a large sample size to research on.
Also, are the effects of bone density loss and muscle loss more affecting women than men, especially postmenopausal women?
Good question. So that's actually what my current research is focusing on. We do see sex-associated differences. Well, I'm using a rat model for space, actually, because we couldn't directly test astronauts. There aren't even that many women astronauts in the first place. But we did see one sex-associated differences where the females were experiencing greater loss in bone, muscle, and fat loss. And then we also saw hormone-related differences that were separate from sex. And so when the female rats, for example, did not have sex-associated hormones, such as their estrogens, they experienced even more significant losses. And so I do think that there need to be efforts in the future towards, more surveillance and maintenance of specifically women astronauts who may be older, pre or post-menopausal, to ensure that they're not experiencing such bone, muscle, and fat losses.
I guess I was wondering, how do you recreate the weightlessness on Earth to do research?
Yeah, that's a very fair question. It's not a perfect model. There are a couple different ways we can use, a couple different techniques we can use depending on what you're trying to model. So for rats, if you're trying to model microgravity or 0G, we do something called hind limb unloading. So you essentially pick the rat or mouse up from its tail or the hind part of its body, and you lift it such that the hind paws or legs are not touching the ground. And so within that localized system of the hind leg, you're able to mimic zero gravity. And then if you want partial gravity, we do something called partial weight bearing. Essentially, you put the mouse or the rat in a like little jacket, and then you pick it up ever so slightly. And so all the feet are still touching the ground, but it's only bearing maybe about 40% of the weight instead of 100% of the weight. And that kind of mimics the partial gravity you might see on Mars, for example.
Awesome, thank you.
Absolutely.
If we have any more questions, and if not, I see our time here is 6:59, so we'll come back at about 7:03.
Sounds
For the
good.
same part.
Thank you. Should I pause this?
I think you can just let it play. I don't
Okay.
actually know. Well, there's another screen that we can flip to, but.
Yeah, sounds good.
Oh,
It's 7:03, so now we'll get started with the second part of the talk.
Awesome, thank you. Moving forward, now we're going to be talking a little bit about sleep and what goes wrong with us in space. And so we kind of think of sleep as being important for both mental and physical activity, whether that's our performance, alertness, memory, mental health, all of that. And then on the physical side of things, we can look at weight maintenance, diabetes, immune system. And recovery here, I mean this in a very broad sense, whether that's actual physical injury or just kind of recovery and consolidation of all of our body systems, whether that's, again, our brain when it comes to mental and physical health, or even other aspects of our body systems absolutely needs sleep to recover, to regenerate, and kind of rejuvenate themselves, if you will. And so this is just, I thought this was a nice picture of how astronauts sleep in space. I know I could never do this. I absolutely have to be like bundled up super tightly. Oh my gosh, I don't know how they do it. But okay, let's switch gears here a little to something called circadian rhythms. A little poll here, what time do you wake up in the morning? 8:30, 8 a.m. Okay, I wake up at 6. What time? I have to. My classes start before then, but what time do you go to bed at night? 12:30? Yeah, midnight. Okay, that sounds about right. And so do you try to stick to that pattern every day? Yeah, you have like a normal sleep-wake cycle. That is a circadian rhythm. It's this kind of internal clock you have that regulates when you're waking up, when you're going to sleep. And if you're sticking well to it, you have a good sleep hygiene, then you're very in line with your circadian rhythm. And so a lot of things can control your circadian rhythm, whether that's exercise, hormones, electronics has kind of come to the forefront as well with all the blue light that gets emitted, and then also just brain signaling. But by and large, the biggest controller of circadian rhythm is the sun. You know, we wake up, the sun's outside, it's a good day, it's easy to get out of bed. And then contrast that to when, let's say it's gloomy, it's overcast, it's raining. I know I never want to get out of bed in those kind of on those kind of days. And so the sun and kind of, especially the light that it's emitting specifically, is really important for regulating our circadian rhythm. However, in space, this can obviously get disrupted, whether it be, again, microgravity, like we talked about, just the physical comfort of whether or not you can sleep floating. There's also the International Space Station will orbit the sun every 90 minutes instead of us, who orbit the sun every 24 hours. And so they see the sun every 90 minutes then, and so that can obviously be very disruptive to your circadian rhythm. Again, there's electronics, and then of course the stress associated with a mission or a spacewalk like shown here can be very stressful as well. The main takeaway though is that disruptive sleep will obviously lead to disrupted performance. What happens to you when you don't get enough sleep? Grumpy, yeah, I get super cranky when I don't get sleep and I need a nap. I know I can't think properly. I know I'm not going to do well on whatever exam I have the next day. It's a bad time all around. And astronauts are people too, you know? They're going to be experiencing those same kind of problems that we do when they have disrupted sleep. And so there's a couple ideas on how we can fix this. The first being lighting, whether that's, shielding. We can't exactly completely, shield ourselves off from the sun, but maybe there can be some kind of workarounds. You can specifically time when you're exercising, when you're eating, because that can affect the kind of hormones or signaling your brain is sending in order to govern your circadian rhythm. And then finally, something more recent is called or CBT. This is sort of a newer idea in psychology whereby they're saying kind of that there's this relationship between your thoughts, behaviors, and feelings. And so if you're able to shift one of those, you're able to shift the other two. An example of this would be sleep hygiene, like I mentioned. You know, they kind of say you're not supposed to do work or eat in your bed because your bed should only be for sleeping. And so if you start, you know, changing your behavior to stop eating or working in bed, you're able to, in your mind, your thoughts are able to associate your bed with sleep. And so you should theoretically be able to sleep better at night because then your brain is saying, oh, we're in bed, this is a sleeping only zone, as opposed to, oh, we're in bed, time to do some homework. So hopefully, you know, associating that for astronauts as well would be helpful. They have a system in place where astronauts, before they go on a mission, can opt in to CBT, and then they continue that during their time in space, I think about once a week, if not more frequently, to hopefully be able to improve or prevent sleep problems before they happen. However, there is not a system in place where, let's say, an astronaut who did not opt in now is experiencing sleep problems, they're not able to opt in once they're in space. And so there is that kind of infrastructure barrier to accessing care. And so an overview of sleep now. Obviously very important mental and physical functions. We've seen how circadian rhythms can get disrupted in space. Disrupted sleep will lead to disrupted performance, and some solutions for that may include lighting, scheduling of missions, CBT therapy, and also sleep medications, though again, this is kind of a last resort when it comes to improving sleep for astronauts. Any questions?
Again, if you're joining us on the live stream, you can type your questions into the YouTube chat, and we'll see if we see any of those pop up, we'll pass them to our speaker. I was wondering, do you know if there's any overlap between sort of research into the circadian rhythms of astronauts and also sleep disruptions for things like being in the Arctic Circle where it's dark?
Oh yeah, good question. So people who work in those kind of environments, as well as even people here, you know, not in extreme environments like the Arctic Circle, people who have like shift work. So for example, if they're night shift instead of day shift, or if they have kind of erratic scheduling, such as airline pilots, they also make really good kind of research candidates for not only obviously like circadian problems in and of themselves as a group who have sleep problems, but also kind of analogs for astronauts in terms of, all right, they may not have the same kind of sleep disruption, but they have sleep disruption. What's going on and how can we solve it? So that's also, you know, there's some groups over in the NASA Ames Research Center over in California called like the Fatigue Countermeasures Laboratory, and they're very specifically looking at what's going wrong with sleep from both like an astronautic standpoint and aeronautics, and then again, what are the countermeasures we can do to solve that, whether that be lighting, therapy, medications, or what more.
This is sort of unrelated, but you mentioned how like mice models are like pretty regularly used with
Yes.
and stuff. Do mice have like a similar sleep schedule to like humans and like other?
Good question. So mice are actually nocturnal, so it makes studying them for sleep very difficult. As far as I know, I don't think mice or rats are really often used for sleep studies. I think better candidates for that would be, you know, research volunteers, whether that be like pilots, subjects who live in the Arctic, those who have night shift schedules. I think a couple years ago, some of my research was focusing on sleep, and we had participants who volunteered to be woken up throughout the night, and we would have EEGs to look at their brain scans. We would give them like subtraction tests to see if their cognitive performance was affected, and then we would do that with people kind of in their normal environment, and then also in their normal environment, but now there's a very harsh blue light getting turned on when they wake up, with the thought that maybe when they wake up, if we add blue light, it will improve performance and alertness faster. It's still very much an area of active research, but I don't think mouse models would be the best way to do that.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
See if we have any final questions. Don't see anything in the
Oh,
chat.
what is that?
Oh, yes.
Oh, the question is, has artificial light been used for replicating natural light and maintaining their circadian rhythm? Yes, not only for astronauts, but if you guys are familiar, there's something called happy lights, which are essentially, like happy lights for people. And so it's like grow lights for plants, but for people. And so I actually just bought one myself. What you can do is when you wake up, or as you're waking up, the light is also turning on, and it kind of has that similar yellow-white spectrum to it, just like the sun does. And so it's supposed to mimic like a natural sunrise. And then when you're going to sleep, you can have it mimic a natural sunset. And that's hopefully supposed to help you elongate your circadian rhythm so that you have a better wake cycle, which is really important for things like, daylight savings, yes. When our rhythms are suddenly shifted by an hour, our body needs time to catch up, and so you can use artificial light as a mimic for natural light, and therefore, kind of influence your circadian rhythm. And, as I mentioned, blue light can also be used not necessarily to mimic natural light, but sort of disrupt the signaling that's happening and kind of jumpstart your circadian rhythm so that you can do research.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your question. And then it is now 7:14 here, so we'll take a break until about 7:17.
Sounds good.
Alrighty. It's now 7:17, so we can reconvene for the final part of this talk.
Switch on again. All right. Last part, vision. I love this slide. Or I love this section. I think it's very interesting. Let's jump into it. So before we get started, there is some very basic eye anatomy that you unfortunately need to know. So very quickly, I'll point out the things that are most relevant for this talk, though perhaps later on. Absolutely feel free to explore more. Because the eye can be very complicated, especially with how it kind of connects and signals with the brain. But very briefly, what we need to know is that there is a cornea out here, and that's kind of the clear outer layer outside your eye. The lens is this circular disc-shaped structure. It's the one that's like bending and shaping the light so it can focus, and then the light will pass through it'll hit the retina over here, and that's where the light actually gets registered, and then it goes through the optic nerve to your brain for further processing. So again, the important parts: the cornea, the lens, the retina, and the optic nerve. Okay. So there are two, again, we talked about microgravity and radiation in the beginning. Those two can kind of independently affect vision. So getting started with microgravity, as I mentioned before, we can see fluid shifts in the body, and so that fluid can cause your brain or your nerve to swell, that optic nerve that I mentioned, and then it can also affect the shape of the eye. So instead of being kind of circular, it gets squished, and then our lens, the one that's bending the light, it's getting affected, it's getting squished, just like the rest of the eye. And then all of a sudden, your light is not getting focused on your retina appropriately. And so the combination of these two can affect your cognitive ability, whether it's from your brain or your optic nerve. It can affect hormone signaling. If the part of the brain that affects hormone signaling is structurally changed or it's swollen, that will affect hormone hormone secretion, regulation, and then finally blurry vision, as I mentioned, if the lens is getting distorted. And what's really interesting is that almost all astronauts experience this. I think the statistic is somewhere around 70 to 80% of astronauts experience these kind of problems. It's called spaceflight associated neuroocular syndrome. So spaceflight, it happens in space. Neuroocular, it's affecting both your nerves and your brain and your vision. Syndrome, just kind of descriptive of what's going on. And then finally, radiation has a couple different effects. One is called light flash phenomenon. And so this happens kind of from something called galactic cosmic radiation, or GCR. And this is kind of the chronic background radiation that the universe is emitting and that we're getting exposed to. And so those subatomic particles are traveling through space. You can't see them. It's not technically radiation like we think of with X-rays or UVs, but it's traveling across space, and then it's getting registered on the retina, and then you get these little light flashes in your vision, which is kind of scary if you think about it, right? And so some research has shown that astronauts, I think around half of astronauts experience light flash phenomenon, and it can kind of present as discrete dots, as streaks, as maybe some clouds, some big supernova almost like events, kind of a range of presentations, and I'm sure it has something to do with what the particles are coming from, where they're coming from, and how we're interacting with them, or specifically how our retina is interacting with them to register it through our optic nerve and brain. Second, we can also see the formation of cataracts are increased in astronauts. And so cataracts are when the cornea, that outer layer of your eye, is irritated, and then eventually it becomes cloudy. You may have heard of glaucoma. That's from cataract formation. And so research is also pointing to this idea, or this kind of increasing amount of data, that astronauts in space from the radiation are more sort of predisposed to cataract formation. Unfortunately, there are no easy solutions for either spaceflight associated neuroocular syndrome or the light flash phenomenon or the cataracts, because we're in space. How can we stop microgravity? Or again, in space, how can we completely get rid of radiation? It's not like we can put lead everywhere to block it, right? That would be incredibly dangerous. And so this is absolutely an area of active research. There are some ideas that you can kind of increase, I think they're called like negative pressure systems. And so instead of having increased pressure in your brain, in your eye region from those fluids, how do we, using technology or like exoskeleton type things, how can we promote that fluid to come back down and decrease the swelling in your head? But nothing concrete yet, nothing really great so far. So, I don't know. We have yet to see. And I think that's why this excites me so much, especially from like the vision standpoint, because it's absolutely an area that, we can contribute to and kind of make strides in order to make space travel much more of a real possibility. So, summary. Microgravity and radiation are both affecting eye and brain function, and then these leads to vision problems. Unknown that maybe you or I will be the person to discover that. Any questions here?
Great, and as a final reminder, if you're watching the live stream, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and then we'll get those to the speaker. Do you have any questions from the audience here?
The term microgravity is defined on the handout as weak gravity, but as you've been saying here, it isn't really weak gravity, it's like no gravity.
Yeah, it's pretty much like no gravity, and so the only reason that it's called microgravity instead of zero gravity is kind of this idea that no matter where you are in the universe, you will still be affected by the slightest amount of some gravitational field. If we're in space, even between the moon and Earth, we're basically floating. It's basically zero gravity. The Earth still has maybe some microscopic effect on us. The moon still has some microscopic effect on us. Pluto, far, far away, still technically has some microscopic effect on us. And so more recently, the term has been to use microgravity as opposed to zero gravity.
Well, what can that effect be other than the attraction of gravitational fields? What other effect could gravity have on?
Yeah, so in space, it's not really the gravity itself that's having an effect because it's so microscopic, but it's more so the lack of gravity that we're seeing is causing these problems.
So historically speaking, when did people start being interested in like researching these vision problems?
Ooh, good question. I think, I don't know exactly for sure, but I know that even with the earliest space missions, things like the light flash phenomenon and blurry vision were being described when astronauts would come back. And so things like spaceflight associated neuroocular syndrome have been studied sort of extensively. And so it's kind of crazy to think how even with all this time, we still don't have any very good solutions for it.
Don't see it in the chat.
Just like in the overall scope of human health in space, would you say that like microgravity effects or like space radiation effects are more harmful to you?
So you're saying microgravity versus radiation? It's a good question. It probably depends on who you ask. If someone's interested in, let's say, orthopedics, they would probably answer microgravity versus like neurologists might answer radiation. I think it's really, you can't separate the two. You know, there's some research that's been showing, you know, if you look at going back to rat models for space, if you put them in just a microgravity environment, or you know, a microgravity analog, nothing really happens to certain immune markers. If you give them radiation alone, nothing really happens to certain immune markers. But when you combine the two, you can see huge changes in those particular like biomarkers. And so I think it's really this kind of synergistic effect of both microgravity and radiation that are at the forefront of causing all of these problems, as opposed to necessarily one or the other. I think vision kind of exemplifies that with both, you know, the blurry vision as well as things like light flash phenomenon or cataracts.
Have there been like any long-term like follow-up studies of astronauts post like spaceflight in terms of like studying neurological disorders associated with that?
Good question. I don't know about neurological disorders specifically, but I know for vision, for example, after a short while, normal vision does tend to get restored, but I don't know how far out that was taking place. But definitely interesting.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
And then one question that I always like to ask, what brought you to this field of research?
Oh, good question. So we'll have a wrap up really quickly after this, but kind of my whole spiel on this was I used to be solely pre-med. I was set on like just an MD track, and so I was shadowing different physicians. And one of them, Dr. Dana Levin, who's over at Columbia, I was shadowing him in emergency medicine, and then he kind of turns and he says, well, I'm also, you know, certified in aerospace medicine. Would you like to learn more? I had never heard of it before. Absolutely, tell me more. And he's telling me about how he works with NASA to design something called Exploration Medical Capability, or XMC. It's essentially this database that looks at almost like a volume benefit analysis of different medical equipment to see, you know, if/when we go to Mars, what would be the most beneficial and efficient medical devices to take up there in case something goes wrong. And so I was sitting there and I was like, oh my God, you know, in like 30 years, I want your job. Like, I want to be doing what you're doing. And so I completely pivoted from kind of whatever I was interested in at the time towards bioastronautics, towards aerospace medicine, to try and really, because I kind of see this as a field that there's so much going on, there's so much we don't know. I really think this is something that I and the rest of you can all contribute to. So I think it's just something that brings out so much excitement and like hopefulness in people and my colleagues, which is nice.
Awesome. And it looks like we have one question in the chat. Aaron asks, are there preventative measures that astronauts can undergo while on Earth to help minimize the effects seen from microgravity environments?
Good question. There is really, they have very rigorous exercise regimes before space that also get kind of maintained as best as possible during space. You know, astronauts can usually exercise for about 2.5 hours when they're on the International Space Station, which is quite a lot of time. And so the idea is, in terms of preventative measures, we talked about CBT, right, for sleep. And then also we want to ensure that they are already in peak physical condition, like I mentioned before, to ensure that, you know, they don't have any kind of pre-existing conditions that will get worse in space. And so they'll have, again, very rigorous sort of exercise regimes. They'll be sort of as healthy as possible. But you know, we can't completely erase the effects of microgravity and radiation just because it sort of is what it is, and we can only try and develop countermeasures for it instead of prevent it completely.
Just out of curiosity, is there like do astronauts have to like have 20/20 vision?
No, so it used to be that they were required to have 20/20 vision, but now they need to have 20/20 vision. They need to have vision that's correctable to 20/20. So if you have really bad eyesight, but you wear like contacts or glasses, they can correct your vision to 20/20. That's perfect. That counts. You're not excluded from astronaut candidacy, especially because, you know, over half the astronauts are experiencing blurry vision anyway. It's sort of a moot point at that point, you know.
So there's no like harmful effect to wearing contacts in space?
Not that I know of, though I do think glasses are preferred by astronauts who have gone up there needing corrective measures for their vision. Just because I'm sure you don't want like your saline solution floating around and getting into whatever it shouldn't be getting into.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Alrighty, I think that wraps it up for questions, unless we have anything else.
Speed through the wrap up so that we can just get out of here relatively on time. So what did we talk about today? We know that long duration human space exploration is absolutely becoming a possibility in the very near future. However, that can be associated with a lot of different health risks, whether that's musculoskeletal, sleep, vision. A lot of solutions may exist to that, whether that's exercise, surveillance of hormone levels, surveillance of different biomarkers. We can think about how we can affect our sleep conditions, our timing, maybe technology to try and, again, like I mentioned, change the pressure systems in our body so that we can reduce things like blurry vision or light flash phenomenon. However, if you remember the slide from earlier, there are a lot of different health problems, and we have only begun to uncover kind of just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to these health risks in space. And so it's kind of, I guess, the final thought to leave you with, that this is an active area of research, and hopefully we will continue to explore that further. So I'd like to thank a number of people that helped make this possible, and thank you to all of you as well for listening, both in person and online.
Thank you so much for your fantastic talk. That was great. And then thank you for coming, and thank you for watching on the live stream. We'll have another talk next week at the same time at 6:30 p.m. on Wednesday here in person in Northwest Building on Harvard's campus, room B101, and also on a live stream. So I hope you'll come